Awaken your spirit, chosen ones. When people lose control over you, they don't get quiet, they get nervous. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Not the fight, not the betrayal, not even the isolation. It's the moment you realize the very people who once acted untouchable are suddenly watching you, like you're the unpredictable variable in a room full of planned outcomes. The energy shifts, conversations change, smiles start coming a second too late, and you can feel it. Something has gone off script. Here's a fact that most people overlook. Groups that rely on secrecy and influence collapse fastest when their target stops being emotionally available, not when they're exposed, not when they're challenged loudly, but when the person they were feeding on disengages and regains internal authority. Power structures built on manipulation don't fear confrontation, they fear independence, because independence can't be negotiated with, threatened, or guilted back into place. What makes this story unsettling is that there was no dramatic showdown, no grand announcement, no victory speech, just one individual quietly refusing to stay programmable. While they were busy coordinating reactions, you were recalibrating your entire operating system, and that's where things started getting awkward for them. Because nothing terrifies a coordinated group more than someone who no longer reacts on cue. There's also a strange, almost comedic element to it. The same people who once moved like a synchronized unit now look like a group chat where everyone's typing but nobody knows what to say. The confidence is gone. The certainty cracked. You didn't raise your voice, you raised your standards. You didn't fight back, you stepped out. And somehow, that did more damage than any confrontation ever could. This isn't a story about overpowering enemies or playing hero. It's about what happens when someone exits a psychological trap without asking for permission, when the influence dries up, when the target stops being the target and becomes the anomaly. That's why they're uneasy. Not because you attacked them, but because you walked away with your mind intact. Number one, you didn't fight them on their battlefield. You removed yourself from their spell economy. They thought power meant pressure, noise, coordination, numbers. They believed if enough people thought the same thing about you, spoke the same way about you, or reacted to you in sync, you would eventually bend. That was the battlefield they built. Emotional engagement, constant reaction, endless explanation. What they never planned for was you stepping off it completely. Not storming away, not making a scene. Just quietly refusing to keep paying into a system that only worked because you were present inside it. Their influence ran on something very simple: your energy, your attention, your emotional responses. Every time you felt the need to defend yourself, over-explain, prove your intentions, or fix what they distorted, the system stayed alive. You were unknowingly funding it. The moment you stopped doing that, the machinery began to stall. No reactions to recycle, no emotions to twist, no access point left to exploit. And without access, their so-called power became theoretical instead of real. This is where the panic started, because nothing confuses manipulators more than someone who stops participating without asking for permission. You didn't challenge their authority directly. You made it irrelevant. You didn't argue with the narrative. You exited it. That's a loss they can't spin, because it exposes the truth. They were never strong on their own. They were strong because you were there. What looks like withdrawal from the outside was actually precision. You conserved your energy instead of wasting it on people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped reacting to bait disguised as concern. You stopped feeding conversations that went nowhere. And slowly, almost comically, the pressure dropped. Not because they became kind, but because they ran out of leverage. That's why they're shaken now. You didn't defeat them by force. You defeated them by understanding the real currency of control and refusing to spend another unit of it. Once you step out of the spell economy, there's nothing left for them to trade in, and they know it. Number 2. They lost because you refused to internalize the identity they assigned you. From the beginning, they needed you to accept a role. Not because it was true, but because it was useful. Every manipulative group survives by deciding who people are before those people decide for themselves. You were framed as the problem, the odd one out, the unstable one, the difficult one, the one who doesn't get it. None of those labels were accidental. They were tools. Once a label sticks, everything you do gets filtered through it, and suddenly you're defending yourself instead of living your life. What they expected was slow erosion. A little self-doubt here, a second guess there. Maybe you'd start adjusting your behavior to seem more acceptable. Maybe you'd shrink parts of yourself to avoid friction. That's how identity capture works. You don't get forced into a box. You get nudged into stepping inside it on your own. But you didn't, and that refusal broke the entire strategy. Instead of arguing with the labels, you simply didn't wear them. You didn't wake up every day trying to disprove what they said. You didn't spend your energy correcting their version of you. You quietly checked in with yourself and realized something important. The people defining you had no real authority over your inner life. Once that clicked, the labels stopped sticking. Words only have power when you agree they describe you. This is where their grip slipped, because control depends on internalization. They needed you to believe their story about you, even a little. Once you stopped measuring yourself through their lens, their opinions lost weight. You could hear the talk without absorbing it. You could notice the behavior without personalizing it. And when that happens, manipulation has nowhere to land. What scared them wasn't defiance. It was your neutrality. You weren't trying to prove you were good. You weren't trying to show you were right. You simply knew who you were, and that knowing didn't require witnesses. That kind of self-definition can't be negotiated, threatened, or rewritten. They lost because they were fighting for control of an identity you had already taken back. And when someone owns their identity from the inside, no group, no narrative, and no coordinated effort can overwrite it. Number 3. What terrified them most was not your resistance. It was your clarity. They thrived on confusion. Their power depended on foggy lines, half-truths, and unpredictable reactions. They counted on hesitation, guilt, and doubt. The moment you acted without clarity, they lost their advantage. They weren't afraid because you said no or pushed back. Those things they could handle, even anticipate. What shook them to the core was that you could see the mechanics of their game and operate outside it. You weren't reacting emotionally. You weren't guessing. You weren't feeding the narrative they spent months constructing. You were functioning from a place that had no openings for manipulation. Clarity doesn't just break control, it exposes it. Once you understood their motives, methods, and what they needed from you, every tactic they deployed lost impact. Their whispers, their staged alliances, their subtle digs, none of it landed. They were no longer invisible, mysterious, or untouchable. You saw through the theater, and that kind of vision is terrifying because it can't be bargained with. There's no room for lies or illusions when someone operates with that level of understanding. Even more, clarity is contagious. When you carry it, it radiates in small ways that disarm their allies, disrupt their timing, and sow doubt in their ranks. They start questioning each other, second-guessing the plan, losing the rhythm they depended on. The more you operate with certainty, the more chaotic their coordinated system becomes. They relied on a network of fear, but fear only works when it is paired with uncertainty. Remove the uncertainty, and suddenly their fear has no place to land. They probably didn't notice it at first. They expected subtle resistance, small errors, maybe a short emotional outburst. But what they got was precision, decisions made without hesitation, boundaries enforced without drama, a calm, unshakable presence that rendered their schemes irrelevant. That level of control over yourself, over your perception, over your reactions, was more dangerous to them than any direct fight. They weren't just losing influence. They were realizing that the person they thought they could manipulate had become untouchable, because you could see everything, and nothing you did could blind you. Number 4. You didn't expose them publicly. You exposed them structurally. They were prepared for noise, accusations, emotional reactions, public call-outs. That's what they train for. They know how to twist stories, flip blame, and turn exposure into chaos. What they were not prepared for was you changing the structure around them so their influence stopped working. You didn't try to convince everyone who they really were. You simply made it impossible for their tactics to function the way they used to. Instead of fighting the narrative, you changed the conditions that allowed the narrative to survive. You altered routines. You withdrew cooperation. You stopped being predictable. Small shifts on the surface, but massive consequences underneath. Their messages stopped landing. Their pressure points stopped producing results. Their usual moves didn't trigger the reactions they counted on. And when a system relies on repetition, disruption is fatal. This kind of exposure is invisible at first. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened, but inside their world, everything starts malfunctioning. The people they leaned on start hesitating. The timing goes off. Coordination weakens. Not because you said anything, but because the structure that carried their influence no longer had access to you. You removed key supports without announcing it, and the whole thing started wobbling. They couldn't call you out because you didn't attack them. They couldn't retaliate because you didn't accuse them. There was nothing to defend against, nothing to disprove, nothing to twist. All they could feel was loss of control, and loss of control is terrifying when power has always been indirect. What really unsettled them was how clean the shift was. No mess, no public drama, no emotional explosion, just consequences quietly stacking up. They realized their authority only worked inside a specific arrangement, and you stepped outside that arrangement without asking permission. That's not rebellion, that's removal. Structural exposure leaves no villain and no hero. It leaves only truth. If something stops working the moment one person withdraws, it was never strong to begin with. They weren't exposed because you told on them. They were exposed because once you changed the structure, their power couldn't survive the light of normal reality anymore. Number 5. Their strength depended on collective intimidation. Yours didn't. They were never powerful as individuals. Strip away the group, and what's left is hesitation, insecurity, and borrowed confidence. That's why they moved in packs, shared looks, coordinated silence, echoed opinions. It wasn't unity, it was insulation. Each person hid behind the presence of the others, using numbers to simulate authority. As long as everyone stayed in formation, the illusion held. But illusions collapse the moment someone stands alone without flinching. Your strength didn't come from backup. It didn't come from agreement or validation. It came from something far less visible and far more dangerous to them: self-grounding. You didn't need to check the room before speaking or acting. You didn't need permission disguised as consensus. While they needed alignment to feel brave, you operated from internal certainty. That imbalance was never in their favor, even if it looked like it was. Collective intimidation only works when fear is contagious. They expected their numbers to overwhelm you, to make you doubt yourself simply because you were outnumbered. But fear can't multiply if it doesn't enter the first host. You didn't absorb it, you didn't mirror their anxiety, you didn't shrink just because more voices spoke at once. And when fear fails to spread, a group built on intimidation starts turning inward. This is where the cracks formed. One person hesitates, another second guesses. Someone starts wondering why all this effort is needed against one individual who isn't even reacting. The energy shifts from dominance to insecurity. What once felt like strength becomes exposure. The group can sense it, even if they won't admit it. Their power only existed as long as everyone believed in it at the same time. You, on the other hand, didn't need belief from anyone else. You weren't amplified by numbers, so you couldn't be weakened by isolation. Standing alone didn't drain you, it clarified you. And that's what they couldn't counter. You showed that real strength doesn't get louder in groups. It gets quieter, steadier, and harder to shake. They depended on collective intimidation because without it, they had nothing. You didn't depend on anything external at all. And that's why one grounded individual was enough to undo what they needed an entire group to maintain. Number 6. They were operating on borrowed authority. You were operating on self-trust. Everything they did relied on approval, validation, or someone else backing them up. Titles, group consensus, spiritual phrases, whispered endorsements, all of it was borrowed authority. Alone, stripped of witnesses and supporters, their influence evaporated. They could coordinate, manipulate, and intimidate, but only because they counted on people believing in the weight of what they claimed. Take away that belief, and suddenly their power is just noise. You operated differently. You didn't need anyone to confirm you were right, strong, or capable. Your authority came from inside. It wasn't performative. It wasn't dependent on applause, agreements, or collective fear. You knew your limits, your vision, and your boundaries, and you acted accordingly. That kind of certainty is impervious to opinion, because it isn't derived from opinion. It isn't borrowed. And that makes it dangerous for anyone whose influence relies on dependence. They expected leverage, they expected hesitation, doubt, or the need for validation. Instead, they found someone who trusted their own instincts more than any narrative they could create. When a group built on borrowed authority encounters someone who refuses to borrow, the rules break. Their threats have no weight, their stories have no traction. Their coordinated strategies fall flat because the target they assumed would be pliable is unmovable. What they didn't anticipate is that self-trust radiates. It communicates a quiet warning. You are no longer programmable, and you are no longer predictable. Their whispers, their alliances, their attempts to prove themselves suddenly lose all impact. You don't argue, you don't prove, and you don't explain, because you don't need to. Your inner certainty does the work for you, and it exposes theirs as hollow. They were built to survive on dependence, manipulation, and borrowed credibility. You proved that someone grounded in self-trust doesn't need a system to survive. That invisible internal authority becomes the most destabilizing force in any room. One person who trusts themselves can make an entire structure crumble without lifting a finger, and that's exactly what happened. Number 7. You survived the smear campaign without becoming bitter, and that confused them deeply. They expected drama. They expected outbursts, emotional breakdowns, anger, or retaliation. That's how their game works. They rely on predictable reactions, on people letting the attacks land and fester. They wanted you to bite, to prove them right, to become the character they painted. But you didn't. You stayed intact. You didn't play their game. You didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing you unravel. And that simple refusal to be consumed shattered their strategy. Survival in these situations isn't about silence as weakness. It's about mastering where you place your energy. You didn't waste time trying to justify yourself or clear your name for the sake of appearances. You didn't collect evidence to prove you weren't what they said you were. You didn't feed the gossip mill. Instead, You focused on the only thing that mattered: your stability, your boundaries, your clarity. That's what threw them off. Because manipulators can predict reactions, but they cannot predict composure. There's a particular kind of chaos that comes when someone refuses to react. They start second-guessing themselves, questioning whether the story is working and trying to scramble to regain control. Your calmness wasn't passive, it was active resistance. You became the unmovable point in their swirling storm of lies and half-truths. The more they tried to provoke, the more ineffective their attempts became, and the louder their frustration grew. What made them uneasy wasn't that you fought back, they expected that. What unnerved them was that you proved they couldn't make you fight. They couldn't manipulate your emotions, your reputation, or your self-perception. They realized their influence had limits they hadn't calculated, and that realization is far more destabilizing than any argument or confrontation. By surviving without bitterness, you showed them something terrifying. Strength isn't loud, and victory doesn't require proving anyone wrong. It comes from staying unshakable when everyone else expects you to falter. That quiet mastery of self left them exposed, disoriented, and completely unsure of what to do next. Number 8, you understood that not every attack requires a response. Most people think power comes from proving yourself, defending every slight, or correcting every story. That's exactly what manipulators count on. They rely on the target reacting, over-explaining, or trying to justify themselves, because every reaction feeds their control. Every argument, every defensive explanation, every emotional outburst is like fuel to their fire. You didn't play that game. You realized early on that responding to every jab only gave them what they wanted. You chose differently. Refusing to respond is not weakness, it's precision. It's knowing which battles matter and which are irrelevant. Every attack they threw, every attempt to provoke doubt or guilt, was met with something far more destabilizing than noise: indifference paired with awareness. You didn't ignore them out of fear. You ignored them strategically, conserving your energy and letting the consequences of their actions reveal themselves. You let reality speak while they relied on theatrics and misdirection. This decision shattered their expectations. They planned for resistance, for fights, for emotional chaos. Instead, they got control that didn't bend, wasn't triggered, and didn't justify their actions. Their influence depends on reaction, and reaction didn't come. That silence, calmness, and refusal to engage became more powerful than any argument you could have made. They couldn't script it, anticipate it, or manipulate it. Your lack of response was not absence, it was a barrier, an invisible force they had no way of penetrating. By choosing when to act and when to stay still, you became unpredictable in the most threatening way. Predictability allows manipulators to plan their moves. Unpredictability rooted in self-mastery leaves them scrambling. They realized that all their calculations, all their strategies, and all their attempts to provoke were wasted. You were operating on a timeline and logic of your own, and nothing they could do could bend it. Not every attack needs a response, because sometimes the strongest reply is simply existing unaffected. You didn't just survive their provocations, you turned their tools against themselves by refusing to participate. And that refusal, quiet as it was, became the thing they feared most. Number 9. You stopped trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding you. At some point, it became clear that confusion wasn't accidental. They weren't misunderstanding you because you explained poorly or lacked clarity. They were misunderstanding you because it benefited them. As long as you kept trying to clarify, justify, or make them see you, you stayed trapped in a loop that never ended. You were explaining yourself to people who needed you misunderstood in order to stay comfortable in their position. The shift happened when you recognized that understanding was never the goal. Control was. Every time you tried to correct the record, they twisted it. Every time you clarified, they reframed. Every time you opened up, they used it selectively. That's when you stopped negotiating your identity. You didn't harden your heart. You didn't become cruel or dismissive. You simply withdrew your need for their approval. This was devastating to them because the dynamic relied on your participation. They needed you to keep talking, keep defending, keep proving your intentions. Once you stopped doing that, the entire exchange collapsed. There was nothing left to distort, no more material to weaponize. You didn't owe them access to your inner world, and once you accepted that, you took away their favorite leverage. What made this powerful wasn't silence for its own sake. It was acceptance. You accepted that some people are committed to misunderstanding you because truth would force them to change. And you chose peace over performance. You chose alignment over endless explanation. That decision freed up an enormous amount of energy you had been wasting on people who were never listening. They felt the loss immediately. Without your explanations, they couldn't maintain the story as easily. Without your engagement, they couldn't keep the conflict alive. You moved forward while they stayed stuck, circling a version of you that no longer existed. That's when frustration set in, because nothing is more unsettling than losing access to someone you once felt entitled to dissect. You didn't need to be understood by everyone anymore. You understood yourself, and that was enough. Once you stopped explaining yourself to people invested in misunderstanding you, you stepped out of their grip completely, and there was nothing they could do to pull you back in. Number 10. They underestimated how much strength is built in solitude. While they were busy coordinating, scheming, and trying to manipulate outcomes, you were quietly alone, integrating experiences, observing patterns, and building resilience. Solitude isn't emptiness. It's the training ground for clarity, discipline, and unshakable self-reliance. They assumed isolation would weaken you, make you vulnerable, or force you to bend to their pressures. Instead, it became your advantage. Every moment spent alone fortified your mind, sharpened your perception, and strengthened your internal authority in ways they could never replicate. The kind of power cultivated in solitude doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It grows quietly, consistently, and relentlessly like roots sinking deep into solid ground. You had no one to perform for, no crowd to impress, no hierarchy to appease. Every decision, every boundary, every insight came from your own judgment and reflection. By the time they tried to measure your strength, it had already surpassed anything their group dynamics could match. They built their confidence on echoes. You built yours on reality. They underestimated that power because it's invisible. While they were measuring influence by reaction, numbers, and social validation, you were measuring yourself by insight, resilience, and alignment with truth. The isolation they feared as weakness became the forge where your identity hardened, and your presence became unassailable. They couldn't predict you because they were calculating based on dependency, not independence. And there's a psychological edge to it they didn't anticipate. The more they relied on collective fear and coordinated manipulation, the more isolated and unshakable you became. Every attempt to pull you back in or provoke a reaction failed, because the framework they depended on had no effect on someone who was already self-contained. They realized, too late, that one person standing firmly alone can dismantle the illusion of control that took a whole group to maintain. Solitude taught you patience, observation, and self-trust. It revealed that real strength doesn't need validation, coordination, or approval. It only needs a mind willing to stand alone, a heart unwilling to compromise integrity, and a presence that no group can influence. That's why they didn't just fail. They panicked. You weren't just surviving in solitude. You were thriving in a way they could never touch. Number 11. Your healing exposed their dependency on your dysfunction. For as long as they held influence over you, your pain, confusion, and self-doubt were their currency. Every reaction you had, every moment of hesitation or insecurity, they counted as a deposit into their system of control. They thrived because your energy, when mismanaged or manipulated, amplified their sense of power. Your struggles were not incidental. They were essential to their perception of dominance. But the moment you began to heal, everything changed. Your growth wasn't just personal. It was destabilizing to them. Healing in this context isn't just about feeling better. It's about reclaiming agency over your mind and emotions. When you stopped allowing their actions to dictate your state, when you repaired the fractures they had relied on, you essentially removed the foundation of their influence. They weren't facing a stronger you in a physical sense. They were confronting someone whose inner equilibrium couldn't be touched, twisted, or exploited. That realization is terrifying to anyone whose strategy depends on someone else's imbalance. Your recovery also revealed how fragile their system truly was. They had been operating under the illusion that their power was inherent, that their coordination and manipulation were invincible. But they weren't strong. They were sustained by your vulnerabilities. Once those vulnerabilities were gone, they had no leverage, no predictable reactions, no way to assert control. Your healing exposed that their dominance was borrowed, conditional, and entirely dependent on the continuation of your struggle. The effect on them was both immediate and insidious. They could no longer manipulate you with guilt, fear, or confusion. Their plans unraveled quietly but powerfully, because what they had relied on to keep you contained had disappeared. Every tactic that once worked suddenly felt empty, and that emptiness bred panic. Healing, in its purest form, is a kind of invisible rebellion. You didn't attack, retaliate, or call them out. You simply restored yourself. And in doing so, you demonstrated something more dangerous than confrontation. A person who can exist whole, intact, and unshakable outside the web of manipulation becomes untouchable and exposes the illusion of power for what it really is. Number 12. They're afraid because you didn't replace them. You outgrew them. Their entire strategy depended on keeping you within reach, within the narrative they controlled. They assumed that conflict could only be resolved if you stayed on their terms, if you remained visible in their orbit, if you stayed engaged in the dance they choreographed. What they didn't anticipate is that you didn't need to fight them, prove yourself, or replace their presence with something else. You didn't rise above them to show dominance. You rose above them by moving beyond their relevance entirely. That is far more destabilizing than any confrontation could ever be. Outgrowing someone is subtle but absolute. It doesn't require drama, confrontation, or explanation. It's a shift in scale, perspective, and energy. You don't need to prove that you're different or better. You simply stop functioning on the same level of influence. You stop being available for their tactics. You stop participating in the expectations they set. And suddenly, everything they relied on to define themselves, maintain control, or feel effective no longer works. That creates a type of fear they cannot calculate, because it isn't about retaliation or correction. It's about absence. This is terrifying to manipulators because their power depends on proximity. They need you in the frame to validate their efforts, to justify their control, to sustain their narrative. When you outgrow them, none of that applies anymore. You exist outside the parameters they can influence, predict, or exploit. Every whisper, every attempt to provoke, every coordinated pressure point loses effectiveness, not because you're reacting differently, but because you're no longer playing the same game. Outgrowing someone doesn't need spectacle. It needs clarity and persistence. By stepping beyond the orbit of their influence, you communicate something far more powerful than resistance: autonomy. They weren't just losing leverage, they were realizing that you had transcended their capacity to control or contain you. That realization doesn't make them angry, it makes them panicked, because they understand instinctively that what they had depended on is gone, and it cannot be reclaimed. When you outgrow them, their relevance dies quietly, but completely. Number 13. You proved that one grounded individual can disrupt an entire covert system. Their operations relied on coordination, alignment, and predictability. Every step, every whisper, every subtle move was part of a larger web designed to manipulate, control, and contain. They assumed that one person could be managed, guided, or neutralized within their network, that someone alone couldn't dismantle what took a group to construct. They were wrong. You demonstrated that all it takes is one person anchored in clarity, self-trust, and discipline to make the whole system wobble. Being grounded doesn't mean loud confrontation or dramatic gestures. It means moving with intention, understanding your value, and refusing to participate in the scripts they set. Every predictable reaction you withheld, every boundary you enforced, every action guided by insight rather than fear, chipped away at the structure they depended on. To them, it must have looked like chaos without a cause, because they couldn't trace the disruption to a single moment. They only saw the unraveling. Covert systems thrive on dependency. They survive because members play roles, feed each other's narratives, and maintain a delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and obligation. But one grounded individual interrupts the flow. Without predictable reactions, their plans lose rhythm. Without internal access, their strategies fail. Without emotional leverage, their coordination collapses. You didn't fight them openly, but you dismantled the mechanics they relied on by refusing to be part of them. The quiet potency of one person acting with self-sovereignty is something manipulators never fully anticipate. They prepare for conflict, deception, and argument, but they cannot prepare for someone whose power is invisible yet absolute, someone whose control over themselves renders external attempts irrelevant. Every coordinated effort they made suddenly lacked foundation. Every alliance faltered. Every threat became hollow. You became the anomaly in their system, the factor that couldn't be predicted, managed, or coerced. And in exposing that vulnerability, you proved a lesson that shakes the very core of manipulation. One grounded, self-reliant individual is more disruptive than an entire network. They can try to regroup, recalibrate, or rebuild, but the truth is clear. One person operating from clarity and certainty can unravel what a dozen people spent years constructing. And that is why they are shaken, scrambling, and completely off balance. Number 14. They're shaking because they know you can never be reduced again. Once someone has seen through deception, survived attempts to manipulate them, and rebuilt themselves from a place of truth, they cross a line that can never be reversed. You reached that line. No lies, no intimidation, no coordinated attacks, and no emotional pressure can pull you back into the system they once controlled. That's what terrifies them. They are facing a person who has transcended the limits they once assumed were unbreakable. You are no longer a participant in their schemes, and that freedom is unassailable. They relied on control, but control only works if the other person can be contained. Every effort they made to dominate, gaslight, or destabilize you was a test to see if you could be bent, misdirected, or manipulated. You passed every test, not by fighting harder, but by refusing to enter their arena on their terms. Every strategy they deployed failed because you refused to shrink into the category they tried to place you in. They are shaking because that refusal isn't temporary, it's permanent. The power of never being reduced again is subtle, but catastrophic for manipulators. You don't have to attack. You don't have to expose them publicly. You exist independently of their narratives, unshaken by their attempts, and ungoverned by their rules. That freedom is like a mirror to their own fragility. It reflects everything they were counting on: your confusion, your self-doubt, your compliance, and it shows that their influence was never real. It was contingent on your participation. What makes this unbearable for them is that you no longer operate on their timeline or under their terms. You've moved beyond predictability, beyond reaction, and beyond their authority. Every threat, every ploy, every whisper of control hits nothing but solid clarity. You are a presence they cannot manage, a reality they cannot rewrite, and a force they cannot diminish. They are shaking, not because they fear what you will do. They fear that nothing they do can ever affect you again. And that realization, quiet but absolute, is far more destabilizing than any confrontation could ever be. You are untouchable because you cannot be reduced, and that is the ultimate defeat for anyone who depended on control. Conclusion. What we've explored here is not just a story of survival, it's a masterclass in reclaiming power that was never meant to be given away. Every point shows the same truth from a different angle. True strength doesn't come from fighting harder, confronting louder, or proving anyone wrong. True strength comes from clarity, self-trust, and the refusal to participate in systems designed to keep you small. You've seen how removing yourself from their influence, refusing to internalize their labels, staying grounded, and embracing your solitude can quietly dismantle the strongest networks of manipulation. You've seen that one person, operating from inner certainty, can disrupt entire structures without raising a hand. You've seen that healing, autonomy, and personal clarity aren't just self-care. They are weapons in their own right, tools that expose illusions and render control powerless. This is more than a lesson in surviving manipulation. It's a revelation of what it means to truly exist beyond someone else's expectations. By not reacting to attacks, by refusing to feed their narratives, and by reclaiming your energy, you shift the entire balance of power. You don't need to replace them, confront them, or even acknowledge their schemes. You simply move forward, outgrow them, heal beyond them, and in doing so, you make yourself untouchable. The people who once thrived on your uncertainty, confusion, or pain are left scrambling because the source of their control has evaporated. You've become the anomaly, the unshakable presence they cannot calculate, predict, or influence. And that is the ultimate triumph, a victory so quiet, precise, and complete that it leaves them powerless without you ever raising your voice. Remember, this isn't theoretical. Every choice you make to operate from clarity, integrity, and self-trust builds a reality where no one can diminish your value. Your power grows in ways invisible to the untrained eye, and it's the kind of power that leaves manipulators shaking, systems collapsing, and your own life expanding in ways you never imagined. If this video helped you see your own strength, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss content like this. Like this video if you felt the impact of these truths. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or experiences, and share it with someone who needs to realize that their power is theirs alone. Your journey, your clarity, and your unshakable presence deserve to be recognized. And this is just the beginning. Stay awakened, chosen ones.